What's up with everybody? It's Memorial B.
And Nicole.
And we're back with some more reaction videos. So this is another special video request from Boy.
Yeah.
He wants us to react to, he or she wants us to react to The Fallen of World War II, baby.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is a documentary.
He's sending us on a World War II trip today.
Yeah, man. We like it, man. We like checking this stuff out, man. This stuff is definitely entertaining. It's like some good history.
Good information. Very informative.
Yeah, man. We'd like to thank you for your support, and we're finna dive right into it.
The average lifespan of an American is 80 years.
Yeah.
And an 80-year-old today
I thought it was 72.
was 10 when World War II ended, 4 when it began. A soldier who saw battle would have to be in his late 80s at least today. Generals, political leaders, the decision makers of the war, few are still with us. And over the past few decades, we've seen authors and filmmakers rush to capture stories from survivors before this connection of memory is lost.
Is that what this is? That would be so cool.
Yeah, The Fallen of World War II.
This project is not about individual war stories, and it's not about survivors. We're going to tally up the tens of millions of people whose lives are cut short by the war, and see how these numbers stack up to other wars in history, including trends in recent conflicts. We'll be counting soldiers and civilians separately. Each of these figures represents 1,000 people who died. Civilians were of all walks of life, whereas military deaths were almost entirely men.
Yeah.
The average age was about 23.
Dang.
In most battles, for every 1,000 soldiers killed, there are more than 1,000 who were injured.
Yeah, it's true.
The word casualty can be confusing because in military speak, it often includes both deaths and injuries, and anything else that takes a soldier out of service. Here, we're just counting the deaths. And we'll begin with American soldiers. Over 400,000 died.
That's a lot.
Most of the deaths occurred in the European theater, fighting the Nazis. And about a quarter were in the Pacific, fighting the Japanese. When you put them on the timeline, you see that casualties were the heaviest at the end of the war. The war began on September 1st, 1939. But the US wasn't willing to join the fight until Pearl Harbor, 2 years in. The deaths increased drastically on D-Day, when the Allies invaded Normandy.
Yeah.
One of the most tragic moments of the war was on D-Day at Omaha Beach, where 2,500 Americans fell.
Ooh, man.
It's the scene from Private.
Yeah,
so about the same number of U.S. soldiers died on this single beach landing as the entire 13 years of the recent war in Afghanistan. The bloodiest battle in the Pacific was Okinawa, which lasted 82 days, during which 12,500 Americans died. About 5,000 of these deaths were at sea from kamikaze attacks. Now let's look at some other countries, starting with Europe. Germany started World War II when it invaded Poland. Poland ultimately lost 200,000 soldiers in the war. Most died after the invasion while the country was occupied by Germany and the Soviet Union.
Wow.
Germany, meanwhile, lost just 16,000 in the invasion of Poland. The Nazis went on to invade and conquer other countries, including Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Greece, and Yugoslavia. France surrendered, but after losing 92,000 soldiers in the Battle of France. Over 200,000 ultimately fell, which includes deaths in POW camps, French colonies, and other fighting. Yugoslavia suffered almost 500,000 military deaths.
That's insane.
The initial invasion brought relatively few casualties on both sides. But the deaths mounted under Nazi occupation due to guerrilla fighting, civil conflict, and mass executions. The Nazi invasions were swift, with relatively few German losses. Even the Nazi commanders expressed surprise at their success. And then we have the United Kingdom and the United States, who were not invaded but took the fight to the Nazis. Britain lost about the same number of soldiers as the US, which includes the British colonies.
Interesting.
Germany lost about 500,000 soldiers fighting the US and Britain in what is known as the Western Front, which took place in France and Belgium. But most Nazi soldiers died in the Eastern Front, Germany's unsuccessful invasion of the Soviet Union. The numbers are staggering.
Oh, look at the amount of Soviet Union.
The most famous battle of the Eastern Front, and perhaps the turning point of the European war, was Stalingrad.
Holy cow.
The German 6th Army successfully took Stalingrad, but then got surrounded by the Soviets and cut off from food and ammunition. 500,000 Nazis would ultimately die in Stalingrad. Another 100,000 were taken prisoner, of which 6,000 would ever return. POWs had a low survival rate throughout World War II, and it was particularly grim in the East. When you include these POWs, roughly the same number of Germans died in Stalingrad as all the Western Front fighting against France, the UK, and the US. And though Stalingrad was a victory for the Soviets,
Yeah, it is.
they suffered almost twice as many losses as Germany.
Yeah.
Wow.
The Soviet Union would eventually defeat the once unstoppable German army, killing 2.3 million Nazis.
Yeah, no, it is.
But winning the
my
war
Lord.
came at a cost.
Russia. Holy cow.
Russia lost a lot of
It's
soldiers.
still going.
Man, I'm guessing they lost the most then.
They lost well over 1 million, maybe several million. Okay, yeah, tons of millions.
It's still going.
Oh my gosh.
Whoa.
I can't even.
8.7 million
lost.
is the official tally by the
Whoa.
Russian military, a hotly disputed number.
That is crazy.
Some studies have calculated as many as 14 million
Wow.
dead.
That's more than anybody combined.
To complete the count of European military deaths, we need to add German deaths from other fronts, including the North and Africa, as well as deaths from other Axis powers allied with the Nazis: Hungary, Romania, and Italy. When you put these European military deaths on the timeline, it looks like this. You can now interact with the chart to learn more. Pause the narration if you would like more time. And now we switch to civilian deaths in Europe.
I feel like some civilian deaths are going to be high too because of all the
Yeah.
bombing and stuff.
6 million Jewish people were killed in the Holocaust.
Well, obviously there's that too.
Yeah.
If you separate this by country, you see that about half, 2.7 million, were Polish. 700,000 were Soviets, followed by Hungary and 17 other countries. Broken down another way, about half of the 6 million were killed in the concentration camps. Over 1 million died in Auschwitz. Most were killed in the gas chambers. Others died from starvation, exhaustion, disease, and other forms of execution. The second most deadly camp was Treblinka, which was exclusively an extermination camp, set up to look like a train
Oh
station.
my gosh.
Mobile killing groups killed 1.4 million Jews. Like with the gas chambers, men were killed first to reduce the risk of revolt.
Yeah.
The Holocaust also includes non-Jewish deaths. Between 130,000 to 500,000 Roma, then called Gypsies, were killed. The numbers are disputed. About 250,000 people with disabilities were killed. Homosexuals, Catholics, and other groups were also exterminated, but their numbers were relatively small. Some historians say that other civilian deaths should go under the label of Holocaust. About 2 million non-Jewish Poles were killed under German occupation, some of which were sent to the gas chambers at Auschwitz. When you combine civilian and military deaths, over 16% of the total Polish population died in World War II, which is the highest percentage of any country.
Poland was almost wiped
But not
out.
the highest in total death count. The Soviet Union again tops that list, losing at least as many civilians as it did soldiers, somewhere between 10 and 20 million. A particularly dark moment for the Soviet Union was the siege of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. German forces surrounded Leningrad before civilians could be evacuated. Supplies, including food, were cut off for 2.5 years.
Oh my gosh.
1.5 million people died as a result.
Yeah.
Mostly from starvation, mostly civilians.
Ugh.
Stalin's cruelty towards his own people is partly responsible for these numbers. He often didn't allow civilians to evacuate from cities, thinking it would cause the soldiers protecting them to fight harder. About 1 million Soviets died in Stalin's own labor camps, called the Gulag. Just about every country suffered civilian losses, especially countries who were invaded. While many died as a result of so-called collateral damage, the biggest numbers occurred when it was no accident. Civilians were exterminated, purposely fired upon or bombed, used as human shields, or intentionally deprived of food. The intentional killing of civilians was done by most warring parties, including the United Kingdom and the United States. The United Kingdom was spared of a land invasion, but still lost 60,000 civilians, largely from German air raids or blitzes, often directed at civilian population centers. The UK did the same to German cities at a much greater magnitude, causing about 10 times the number of deaths. But most German civilian deaths came from the ground at the late stage of the war. Civilians living in occupied regions had to desperately flee from the advancing Soviet army. Rapes were widespread, and death estimates ranged from 600,000 to 3 million. Let's step back and see where we are with the totals. We just counted about 20 million civilian deaths in Europe. If you add this to the European military deaths we already covered, it brings us to over 40 million.
41.
Then we have the Asian
Insane.
theater. Here we see the vast majority of military deaths in Asia came from China and Japan. On the civilian side, about 6 million deaths from China, Indonesia, Korea, Indochina, and the Philippines can be attributed to Japanese war crimes, which are sometimes compared to the Nazi atrocities due to the sheer scale of the cruelty. China had the second highest death count after the Soviet Union. And like the Soviets, the Chinese government demonstrated a stunning willingness to sacrifice its own people. Chinese nationalists opened the dike at the Yellow River, hoping the flood would halt the Japanese advance. 500,000 Chinese civilians or more were killed, which is 2 or 3 times the number who died in all countries in the 2004 Asian tsunamis.
Wow.
But the invasion of China only cost Japan 200,000 soldiers. Most were killed fighting the US and allies in the Pacific War. A significant portion of Japanese civilian deaths were caused by American firebombing and the 2 nuclear attacks. Contrary to official US statements, these airstrikes were directed at civilian populations, not military targets. When you add all the deaths outside of Europe, it brings us to a grand total of 70 million for the war, give or take depending on who's counting and what civilian deaths get included. More people died in World War II than in any other war in history. For comparison, here are 20 or so of the very worst wars and atrocities we have on record. Some of these are more of atrocities than wars, but we've seen how that distinction can get blurry. Some of these spanned across centuries. World War II had the highest body count, and it all happened in just 6 years. The world's population has grown significantly since the earliest atrocities on this list. If you want to compare them in terms of what percentage of the world died, we can adjust the chart to look like this. This rough approximation tells us there may have been more devastating wars before World War II, proportionally speaking.
Yeah, since the population wasn't as high.
When we turn to post-war conflicts, it's hard to say anything that isn't controversial. But the data shows something quite extraordinary has been happening. In 1989, John Gaddis coined the phrase the long peace to identify the absence of conflict between the nuclear powers during the Cold War. 25 years later, the Cold War is over, and the term is still being used, although its meaning may have shifted. European countries have not fought each other, except for this 10-day war in 1956 when the Soviet Union invaded Hungary. When we look at European wars before World War II, it looks like this. They tend to be more frequent as you go back, though smaller in scale. And the largest 44 economies of the world have not battled each other since World War II. Rich countries have fought poorer countries, like the US versus Iraq, but rich countries have not fought other rich countries. Such a period of peace between the so-called great powers hasn't been seen since the Roman Empire.
Okay.
To many, peace is too strong of a word. Wars have occurred since World War II, and they can be grouped into these 4 categories. We don't see colonial wars anymore.
Yeah, because there's still
We've already
wars.
noted that interstate wars between rich countries have not occurred at all. And here we see wars involving smaller economies have tapered off. That leaves civil wars of 2 types, with and without foreign intervention. And this is what these battle deaths look like alongside of World War II. More people died fighting in World War II than in all the wars since. And again, we can't forget about world population, which has almost tripled since World War II. If we scale these numbers to show deaths in proportion to world population, showing the likelihood that a person on Earth dies in battle, the downward trend becomes even more pronounced. Now, this isn't to infer anything about why this trend is occurring. That's a discussion for another day. You can now interact with this chart to explore what conflicts are behind the totals. Now, bear in mind, we're just looking at battle deaths here, not civilian deaths, but those too are in decline. Peace is a difficult thing to measure. It's a bit like counting the people who didn't die in wars that never happened. We give such importance to the word peace, but we don't tend to notice it when it occurs or report on it. Sometimes it takes reminding ourselves of how terrible war once was to see the peace that has been growing around us. Of course, this trend may not continue, and it's not clear how looking at these charts can help us make the right decisions to ensure that it does. But the longer the long peace grows, the more significant it becomes. So if watching the news doesn't make us feel hopeful about where things are heading, watching the numbers might.
That's super interesting.
Yeah, it was a lot of information in there, man. It's just like so many people died. It's like over 70-some million people died.
Over 70 million total. That's with all of the fighting in World War II and all of the civilian deaths.
Yeah, it was just crazy, man, seeing it, man.
Because we'd seen the number where it was 22 million, but that must have just been soldiers.
Yeah.
Almost close
to 100 million people died, man.
Yeah.
It's just
definitely
crazy.
eye-opening.
And all this in in 6 years or something like that?
Yeah. A matter of 6 years.
Ooh, it's crazy,
I mean, you probably just practically almost, quartered the world population or something
Yeah,
in
pretty
that
much.
short period of time.
Yeah, you really have.
It's insanity.
Yeah, man, just see all this stuff. And it has so much, like, information and knowledge in there and stuff like that.
I really like how he pointed out how we are sort of in, like, this long period of peace.
Yeah, we are, yeah.
And I do believe that it's relative because we still hear about these fighting and these wars. But maybe it does say something. Maybe we learned a little bit of a lesson after that World War that we're able to actually talk out some issues more than we used to. Maybe.
The problem is he said something about, like, the rich countries don't fight the rich countries no more. It's more like the rich countries fight the smaller countries.
Yeah, because we're trying to take out the small countries.
But is it kind of like bullying in a sense? Because, like, they don't have the power, so we can just easily annihilate them.
And they're not as, like, hardcore wars probably because they can't compete against the big, powerful countries.
So that's one of those things.
I mean, it does want to give you some hope. It hopes that maybe we learned a little bit of a lesson and maybe we can continue to work towards being more peaceful and not fighting all the time.
Yeah, But yeah, we definitely enjoyed it, man. Thanks, boy. I keep messing your name up, man. Boy, I think I'm saying it right. thanks. This is a great. This is like the best one you gave us so far, man. It was full
Yeah,
of
it
a
was
lot
really
of information.
interesting.
I would like to thank you for your support and
Very
for this
much
amazing
so.
video quiz. We're about to go to the end of this video. If you want to support our channel, check out the link to our Streamlabs. Make sure to leave your video questions there, and we have your videos up between 3 to 4 days. Don't forget to subscribe.
And thumbs it up.
Turn on notifications. It's your man, Boy B.
And Nicole.
If you want to catch me on the next, stay awesome. Peace and love, baby.